So welcome back to the Raised Hunting Podcast, and I'm David Holder. I'm your host. I'm joined today by the two apologetic people that I have to, my son Warren and Easton. But we have some special guests for you guys today, which I'll introduce in just a second, because I'm pretty sure that the topic that we're going to talk about today is one that not just we are interested in, you guys are interested in too. We probably won't even get to cover everything that everyone wants to know about it, but what we are going to talk about today is CWD particularly, and how the state of Iowa is, they just put together a whole new study. We have Jace Elliot and Rachel are here. Rachel, you'll remember possibly if you've been listening to the podcast religiously, was here with Andy Kellner. Am I saying that right? Is that his last name? Another DNR agent, and Easton and I both talked with them. So anyhow, Rachel's back because she's kind of our guru as far as, I'm not knocking Jace, I don't know him that well yet, but Rachel kind of knows the scientific side, but she does a pretty good deal putting it into layman's term where we can all understand it. So we appreciate that. But anyhow, we'll do a couple more housekeeping deals before we get started with those guys. Warren has probably got a few review things that he wants to talk about. I real quick want to tell everyone thank you because you guys made June a new record-setting deal for us as far as scents. I don't know how to tell you guys that we said, as soon as we said the scents were in, boom, you guys just bombarded us, so thank you. Knocks are going flying out the door as well. So is the canine stuff. Someone just wanted a whole gallon of derm spray the other day. So appreciate you guys. Thanks for tuning in. Warren, you got some stuff you wanted to clear up or talk with everyone and thank them?
Just a couple shout-outs. Jeremy Rupsick, Eric Robards, 1209, David Harrison, 9731, and Jobo, 3006.
That's a new one.
3006, I guess. It's 3006, but there's no dash, so we're going to go with 3006.
It's 3006.
Yeah, so appreciate you guys. If you guys enjoy the podcast at all, as you know, please leave us a review and share it. It really helps us grow.
We're down to really long stories now, so I'm not going to give us the pain today.
Well, it's not pain.
We're good.
Two-page stories?
Uh-huh.
I gotcha. All right. Well, cool. Well, then that means that we can kind of get started a little bit. So I think that maybe the first thing that, I want to introduce Jace and Rachel, who are going to be talking with us today. Jace, I'll start with you if you don't care, because you are the one that sent me the study that Iowa has just done on CWD, and maybe if you can just kind of give people a little background on how long that took and what all that covers. It was extensive. I think it was 25 pages, so I read through it. I'm going to need Rachel to interpret some stuff. I took some notes. I think Warren's got some notes being printed right now so that we all have some. And then also, just so you guys know, I polled some of our people and asked some, what are some of the questions that others had as well. So we'll try to hit you guys up, and hopefully we don't. If there's something you don't know, we can always get back to people and send them that information. So, Jace, if you would kind of start with the study and kind of just an update on what you were talking about.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, you bet. So my name is Jace Elliot. I'm the State Deer Biologist with the Iowa DNR. So most of my job is overseeing the population management through regulation setting, the different population surveys that we do to monitor deer population trends at every county, and then all of the outreach that's associated with that. The study that you're referencing is the new Iowa DNR CWD response plan. And you're right, that was a big effort that we had a lot of help with, including Rachel here, who provided some nice epidemiological expertise and things like that. But basically, what this plan does is outlines sort of the comprehensive efforts of our department associated with chronic wasting disease. So, of course, we've always had a plan prior to writing this document, but this document was really an effort to try to provide better transparency in terms of what we're really doing in the name of CWD and how we're prioritizing, surveillance, management, outreach, research, things like that. Because as you alluded to, it's certainly a hot topic. It can be controversial, and I don't think that that's going away anytime soon. So as a government agency, I think it's very important to provide a document of this nature that sort of gives an under the hood look at just how our department is managing this important topic.
Gotcha. So I guess, we don't have a set way to go about doing this. So I'm going to start off with maybe I think might be the toughest question, or at least the one that comes up the most, and that is, how did CWD jump EHD? Meaning, what it seems like the states are really not that CWD is being looked at across the United States. So some states don't even deal with EHD that don't have whitetails. But it seems like, at least in our opinion and some other viewers' opinion, EHD is something that I can go ask. I could have 10 guys show up at my office today and say, have you ever seen a deer die from EHD? And they all nod their head, or they've had some kind of interaction with something that's happened. If I ask them the same question, if I ask them, have you ever seen a deer die from CWD? Almost nobody is able to answer, I've ever seen that. So the question is, why are states looking at CWD so hard and not looking at EHD? Not that they're not, and I don't want to get into what we're doing EHD. First, where and why did CWD take the forefront? And either one of you guys can answer that.
Well, there will certainly be a lot of questions that Rachel will have a far better expertise to deliver, and I can just kind of give my 2 cents in terms of the deer program. But what I want to start out by saying is that we're not interested really in pinning the diseases against each other, because they're both important diseases. They both impact the deer population, and they both impact the long-term sustainability and health of hunting quality and the resource in general. But what we've always said is that CWD represents the greatest long-term threat to that health and quality of the deer population. And that's not always intuitive to people who might not be steeped in the topic, because, as you mentioned, EHD is far more visible, and there's no question that it's making greater short-term impacts today in terms of deer mortalities. What's threatening about CWD in a way that EHD is not is that CWD is 100% fatal, and it doesn't really go away. What we see with EHD is that it's more of an annual disease that impacts deer in a way that varies each year. It also varies locally. Now, last year, of course, was perhaps our most severe EHD outbreak in Iowa's history, and we've only had 12, 13 years of severe outbreak to really speak of. But what we've seen in southern states in our country, and perhaps some of the mid-Atlantic states as well, is that as EHD impacts a deer population over the course of decades, it sort of lessens in the degree of severity and mortality rates, at least as far as we can tell. But the same could not be said about CWD, so it represents a much more persistent threat to the deer population. And I'm sure Rachel has more to add to that as well.
Yeah, I would just say, so this is a really common talking point in our chronic wasting disease ambassador curriculum. So that's a program that Iowa DNR delivers in concert with ISU Extension and Outreach. And so it's a state-specific program to talk about kind of the nuances of chronic wasting disease, because in the course of this episode, you'll see that there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's just a really weird disease that's really unlike most others out there. But the biggest problem is the case count. It's kind of an invisible case count. So when you have hemorrhagic disease come through an area, you walk, a riverbed, and you see, a bunch of dead deer. Oftentimes, people are paying attention to the bucks. Like, you can see the impact when that disease rips through. With chronic wasting disease, occasionally now in Iowa, we do have clinical deer. So these are deer that have survived to end-stage disease, which takes 1.5 to 3 years from the time of initial infection. And so it's a good thing that most people have never seen a CWD, positive deer, or one that looked like it had CWD. Because if we were starting to see that commonly, we'd be in a much more advanced stage in Iowa than we are. We're still in pretty early times. We've had the disease on our landscape, chronic wasting disease on our landscape, for just over a decade. And so we are seeing it kind of move around. It's recently come into central Iowa. It's kind of has an interesting pattern in western Iowa. But what we really know of it is it's in northeast and then south central. So places like Allamakee, Clayton, Wayne, that's where you might see a deer that, actually dies of chronic wasting disease. But elsewhere, it's really new. And most of the deer are just, routine hunter harvests that either the hunter wanted to know the status or, they were contributing to our statewide surveillance program. And so we found that they were positive, but they looked, perfectly normal. They were behaving normal, that kind of thing. So the case count's a really hard thing to wrap your mind around when it comes to chronic wasting disease.
Go ahead, Warren.
Okay, I have a pile of questions. Okay, so my first question would be, what is the problem that we're trying to solve for? What threat are we saying that CWD actually has?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot, of course, and it's, I think, important for hunters to ask, because we might spend some time talking about the incubation period that Rachel alluded to, and that's the fact that when deer basically become infected with chronic wasting disease, there's approximately 1.5 to 3 years before they start showing clinical signs of, health decline, which inevitably results in death. And that gets back to the 100% fatal quality that CWD has, which is a bit unique. What that means is that we're not going to experience some rapid decline of deer population in the next couple decades that wipe deer off the landscape. And I think that's important to understand, because that's simply just not the message. But what we are threatened by, and I'm a deer hunter myself, that's the passion that led me to get into this field and position, and something that I care about deeply. Of course, Iowa has an amazing quality of deer hunting here that I don't think we could really compare to anywhere else in the country as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's something we need to protect and hold on to. The reason why I think that quality is threatened by chronic wasting disease is that what we care about when we talk about deer quality, among other things, is an even age distribution of bucks, meaning that there's a lot of mature, older age class bucks for harvest opportunity. And of course, that leads to what we would all consider to be quality deer hunting experience. Now, if we enter a position in Iowa where we have a very high prevalence rate, meaning that a high proportion of deer become infected with chronic wasting disease, that means that, let's say, every fawn that is born that becomes infected now has a lifespan of, let's say, 1.5 to 3 years, meaning that they're only going to be able to throw 2, maybe 3 sets of antlers in their life. And of course, you guys in the room can appreciate how that would drastically impact the quality of bucks that are on the landscape and the hunting experience overall. So we're not necessarily worried about deer becoming wiped off of the landscape, though new studies from Wisconsin and Wyoming show that population declines are very likely, and you can actually demonstrate with the data in high prevalence populations. But that age class is going to become the most threatened, in my opinion, and we'll just have a very young population of deer, which is something that I would hope we never see.
So then the goal is to preserve the age class?
Well, I think the goal is to maintain the lowest prevalence rate we reasonably can in a way that's acceptable to our stakeholders, in such a way that it delays whatever impacts to the age class might be inevitable over some period of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, to some extent, but it leads me to a lot of other questions. So it says in here, CWD spreads when normal proteins found in the body, called prions, misfold and become self-propagating such that they accumulate in tissues and cause disease. So does that essentially mean that any deer could have something go wrong in its body that then creates CWD and then is transmissible to other deer?
A very good question. So with the prion diseases, and so we can draw from lots of examples beyond chronic wasting disease. So that's obviously a deer disease, a disease of cervids. But more commonly, or at least maybe more in the public kind of consciousness, is something called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. Now that might sound unfamiliar, but when we're in public meetings, a lot of times we'll have someone say, oh, my neighbor died of chronic wasting disease. And what they're generally talking about, because there's no evidence to date that CWD is transmissible to people, though that's kind of what the lingering concern is that, so Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is one of these human prion diseases that can spontaneously occur. And so it's very infrequent, like 1 in a million people is the incidence rate, somewhere around there. And so it's very infrequent, but it can happen. So one day, one of these proteins takes this alternate shape that forces other proteins, the prion proteins around it, to take the alternate shape, and it kind of causes this cascade of activity in the body that results in a 100% fatal disease, very similar to chronic wasting disease. And so we know that that may happen in deer. It's, probably happening at a rate so low that we would not be able to differentiate it, at least. I mean, there's ways to actually characterize sometimes these different kind of origins of disease. The one that we're worried about is infectious. So once a deer, however they arrived at having this alternate shape prion, and it's become infectious, then it can be transmitted to others. And so that's what we're really worried about, is the horizontal spread component. There may be some background, of unknown kind of relevance at this point of a spontaneous mutation. It seemed like that was the case in moose in Norway. So they have kind of a novel origination of chronic wasting disease in the Scandinavian states that was, first characterized in 2016. And they've done additional surveillance, and they caught some animals that seemed to have a kind of a sporadic or spontaneous presentation. And we know that it was different than the infectious form because of the distribution of prions in the tissues. So in kind of what we're talking about in the infectious, chronic wasting disease that we worry about, the prions get distributed throughout the tissues, including the muscle tissue, including the antler velvet, things like that, and all secretions. In these moose that they found, it was restricted just to the brain. And so it seemed like that was kind of an isolated event that we were fortunate to kind of know about. So we have some data to reflect on when we're having these kinds of conversations. But yeah, so what's happening in the US is a little bit less known in terms of that spontaneous component.
But so we could have a deer in an area that has never had any documented CWD that has this happen, and then is able to transmit that to all of the deer in the area. Is that correct?
So the transmissible part,
it's low chances, but it can happen.
So I would say depends on how it presents. So if it presented like that moose, where it was restricted to the brain, basically the brain and the spinal column, the neural tissue, that was not an example of an animal that was infectious to others. So just like CJD in people, when it spontaneously occurs, people who, share a beverage with that person, they're not contracting the disease in that way. So there's different forms, and that's what makes, kind of been saying, chronic wasting disease is complex. And so likely that would not lead to other transmission events unless maybe that deer dies on the landscape and then is consumed by a deer, or, a deer is chewing on the bones or something like that and gets exposed in some kind of additional way.
And I could try to sort of get at, I think, what might be the essence of what you're trying to ask, which is that is chronic wasting disease that we're seeing in Iowa just sort of this background disease that we're just now testing for? And, is that leading to a false narrative of what we're talking about here? And I think what's really clear is that if you look at the surveillance data that we've been maintaining since 2002, so we've been testing approximately 5,000 deer in the state, give or take, every year from almost every county since 2002. That's over 20 years. It took 10 years to even find one case. Okay, and now fast forward till the last few years, we're detecting over approximately 100 or more deer with the same sample size, if that makes sense. So clearly we are on a trajectory that suggests this transmissible disease, which is spreading from deer to deer, is very real, and it's not just some background disease that we're just now looking for. That's sort of a narrative that I hear from time to time, and I think that if you just look at the surveillance data, it makes a very clear case that that's not happening.
Well, and that's where I just have several questions, and just so you guys know, I'm trying to ask the questions that I know hunters are asking, because a lot of these things are really, it looks shady. I read the study. And I think that Iowa's plan, I like the way that most of it's worded, as far as in Missouri, it seems as though the goal is to kill all deer, and that's going to quit CWD, where you guys are still talking about protecting the hunting populations and making sure that there's still a good experience there. But I'm not as smart as you, Rachel, so I have to look at things and try and dumb it down into what this caveman can understand. And so what I'm looking at, like on several of these things, is so from 2001 was the very first detection in a wild whitetail deer in South Dakota. And now is what I'm hearing is that since it's apparently transmissible is the main way that this is going from deer to deer, right, is then the first detection in a whitetail deer east of the Mississippi River in Wisconsin and Illinois is in 2002. And so then when we start tracking and looking for in 2002 in Iowa as well, DNR begins CWD surveillance efforts. So now we start trying to locate this. We don't see anything until 2013. So 2002 all the way to 2013 is our first detection in a wild whitetail deer in northeast Iowa. And then there's an additional detection in the same county, Alameda County, in 2014. Then almost nothing until almost looks like 2019. So almost nowhere else
in between there. So
and then every year it's like every county. All of a sudden 2020, 2021, this county, that county, this county, this county, that county. So we go like 6 years. So it goes all the way from South Dakota to Illinois in a year. And then we have it in Iowa in one spot for 11 years to begin with. And then all of a sudden it crosses the entire state after there was something mentioning partnering and stakeholders in Department of Agriculture. And then all of a sudden it is detected in every county in the state.
In here on a couple of facets. So I'm glad I mentioned this a little while ago about the deer carcass, right? Like that a deer could interact with a deer carcass and it can pick up chronic wasting disease from the tissues because those prions, those misfolded prion proteins are in those tissues. They persist in the environment for likely decades, which sounds insane. Like I understand, but there have been, trials, experimental trials examining this and looking for viability. But I think the important thing to kind of keep in mind is we're not just talking about deer to deer movement. So like that's certainly happening. We know that's happening. There's lots of studies around us that are showing, they can move 100 miles sometimes, like really crazy distances. But we also have people transporting carcasses. So, dead deer harvested in South Dakota, harvested in Wyoming, wherever. And we know that they're coming into our state. We do have intra-state movement regulations. So, people who are following the law, they can't bring in deer from known positive areas. Of course, you don't know it's a positive area until you found that first positive deer or other cervid species. And so there's a lag time with all of these things. And it's not meant to point fingers, but there's definitely other ways that infectious material can move around the country, really.
So if I go to South Dakota and I kill a deer and then I put it in the back of my truck and I drive home, and then it goes to the meat locker, how is that getting to wild deer populations?
So if you bone out your carcass and you leave the offal, you leave whatever in your back 40, that's a way. Or, people dump their carcasses or carcass parts in the ditch. That's a method of exposure. Now, we wouldn't be able to trace that, epidemiologically. It looks too similar. So we can't tell whether it was, a human transport event or a deer to deer, just natural exposure event. So we can't necessarily say where the deer originated from, if it was from Iowa or if it was harvested out of state. That would be great if we had that kind of level of certainty. And maybe that would, sway people's behaviors a little more if they bought into that idea. But we know that deer move kind of across the Midwest. There's a lot of, there's poor genetic signal to kind of tell us where a deer comes from.
So the main goal there that I'm understanding is mitigating a variant that we can't really trace, control, or know about super well. So best case scenario when we're trying to study something is to remove that altogether. Is that correct? So we know it's not a risk. So we know that people bringing in other deer isn't a risk. We can try to keep them from doing that, whether we know it's a big risk or not.
Yeah. And then we have maps that we show. I showed in our virtual public meeting this past November that show, how many, even like forget about out of state, just in state, how many people are harvesting deer in one of our endemic areas. So if we just limit that to Almaquee, Clayton, and Wayne, and then, their home zip code is all across the state, and it's like 70 plus counties that are represented just there. And we know CWD, might be at a lower signal or less available elsewhere in the state because we have 29 counties now that are positive.
And if I could just point out one detail too about sort of the South Dakota to Wisconsin example that you're citing. It's really not the understanding of anyone in the Wisconsin DNR or researchers out there that is when the disease originated in the state. To my understanding, there was no robust CWD surveillance on a county scale prior to 2002 in Wisconsin, and that's because there was no understanding that the disease existed there. If I'm not mistaken, the first case actually came from a clinical deer that was sort of visually observed to be very sick. At that point, it was dispatched and tested, confirmed to be chronic wasting disease, and a very robust CWD surveillance system came from that. But what I've heard from researchers in Wisconsin, which is my home state, is that it's likely that based on what their models are saying, CWD existed in Southwest Wisconsin for decades prior to discovering that clinical case, if that makes sense. And that's actually very similar to the trajectories that other states see, where sometimes it can take a couple decades of known positive cases to begin actually observing those clinical deer on a semi-regular basis, which unfortunately seems to be just starting to happen in certain places in Iowa, which is certainly a cause for concern.
Yeah, well, because that goes to another question I had. So it said the disease was first identified in 1967, and then it hadn't been detected in free-ranging mule deer, whitetail deer, elk, or has since then been detected in free-ranging mule deer, whitetail deer, elk, and moose in at least 36 states and 4 Canadian provinces. So I'm going to guess that 1967 was probably just the first time that this was ever actually identified as CWD. It likely probably existed before then. Is that fair to say?
Interesting story behind that. So I would say we have some confidence that it really, 1960s is when it originated. And that's because there's a series of events that led, we think, to kind of the origination. So I mentioned Scandinavia, they have a novel origination. It's not related to our CWD strains. It's not like a deer from here went over there and, contaminated that area. But in the US, so there was a research facility in Colorado that was studying nutrition. And so they brought mule deer in to this facility. So wild caught mule deer into the facility. They studied them. They looked at, how their metabolism and different aspects. And when they were done, they released them back out into the wild to where they originated. But what also happened was that facility had previously housed scrapie infected sheep. And scrapie is another one of these prion diseases. It's actually basically the oldest prion disease we know of. And there's there's interesting dimensions about this disease because it isn't a food resource for us, a commercial food resource. Affects sheep and goats. So these scrapie infected sheep had contaminated this facility. The deer unknowingly, were brought into this facility, didn't know that, maybe it could force a spillover event into a new species. And so we can't say with like 100% confidence that that's what happened. But the evidence, kind of the weight of evidence suggests that there was this unintentional spillover event that when those deer went back out into the landscape, and some of them did get sick, and they were actually documented in the time that they were in that facility, which is why we can say 1967 is when it was first characterized in a sick mule deer. But likely others were exposed and then went on to live their, their natural lives, but now infected with chronic wasting disease and started on that timeline of, up to maybe 3 years before they would have succumbed, but likely transmitting it to others along the way. And so it takes time, if you have a small signal like that, it takes time to realize it, to be able to detect it. And so that's why all these timelines, we're talking on decades, because it really needs to amplify within the population to be detectable in the first place.
And so then I guess two questions with that. So one, how contagious is this? Like, what percent of deer is this getting transferred to? And then if it's been around since 1967, would there not be some areas in that many states and provinces, would there not be some areas where this is severely affected population? Because I would imagine that the states haven't had any time to try to combat this.
Yeah. So in the kind of the disease world, we talk about like a loading dose, like what actually is the minimum infectious amount that you need to be exposed to, or is it repeated exposures? A lot of that we actually don't know. So we know that we can successfully infect deer, with some sort of dose, but what that minimum is, or, there's a lot of talk about genetic resistance, because that was kind of the backbone of the scrapie, the national eradication program for scrapie in the US, was breeding sheep that were not susceptible to scrapie, aside from a special variant, atypical scrapie, which they're still susceptible to. In deer, there's a lot of talk about that, mostly in the captive world, that they're population that we can control and we can breed them towards, genetic resistance. Unfortunately, what genetic resistance looks like in deer is not total, loss of or lack of capacity of being infected. It's really long, elongated, even more than 3 years incubation period, where they become infectious, are infectious to others, and ultimately will succumb to the disease just over a longer time period. And so I lost my train of thought a little bit. What was our original that we wouldn't see declines in deer, or
Mostly trying to understand how contagious it is. How many deer are actually, if there's 100 deer in the population, and one has it, he's infecting how many deer? And then with as many states and provinces have already had it, why haven't we seen other populations that have seen significant damage caused by this over the past 50 years?
Yeah, I'll close my loop by just saying the genetic resistance piece. So they're still susceptible, they still die of chronic wasting disease, but there is some thought that it takes more times of being exposed, like either more persistent exposure or something like that they don't just always contract it at the get. But the outcome's ultimately the same. And I will just say one thing, and then I'll turn it over to Jace to talk about like other populations. But, what we talk about, again, with our chronic wasting disease ambassador curriculum is our system in the Midwest, much more connected. Like there's not distinct herds per se, or geographic barriers that are, keeping some populations, protected in a way from getting exposed. But in other places where we have this kind of mixing, so if we look to like Prairie Canada, Saskatchewan has a really high prevalence rate, and they are seeing really significant declines in their deer population. And so that's kind of a system that I think is more like ours. So there might be more resilience in a way because there's mixing, there's access to new deer that are unexposed. And even there, we still see those kind of declines.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I think Rachel did a great job basically getting to the fact that, answering specific, like how many deer would get this disease in a group of however many, like that depends on so many variables that we just can't predict. Like how many individual deer does the infected deer interact with? I mean, that's going to be the most important question. What's the nature of those interactions and so on. But in terms of the population declines, the good thing short term with chronic wasting disease is that it, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't lead to a rapid population loss. We're not going to see, and we haven't seen, cervid populations get lost from a landscape in 5 to 10 years. Instead, it takes a longer time of an increasingly younger deer, elk, mule deer population to begin to start seeing a difference in annual survival probability. And that has been demonstrated with recent studies. The closest example would be in southwestern Wisconsin, which is kind of the origin of chronic wasting disease east of the Mississippi. So we've known that the disease has been there for at least 23 years. It's likely that the number was probably closer to 30 or 40 based on what researchers there are saying. Of course, that's using some assumption, but that's just the bottom line.
30, 40 what?
Sorry. That it's likely that chronic wasting disease was impacting deer populations for at least 30, maybe 40 years.
Okay.
Based on the trajectory of the prevalence rates and stuff that they're seeing. We're able to sort of simulate that in other states by looking at if there's a state like Iowa that's been testing deer in almost every county for a decade, and then we just find it 10 years later, it's probably pretty likely that we're at the very early stage of the disease in that county, if that makes sense. Wisconsin's example was they found a clinical deer and they don't understand how long it might have been there. But by sort of back modeling, it's likely that, perhaps 10 to 20 years prior to that is when the disease may have become introduced. In Iowa County, Wisconsin, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Southwest Wisconsin, but from a deer population standpoint, it's hard to beat. I mean, it's like still some of the driftless region that we see in northeastern Iowa. It's farmland in southern Wisconsin, but very much more timber, wooded draws habitat that we don't find in everywhere here in Iowa. So it's sort of like, Iowa County and southwest Wisconsin in general is a really special place for higher deer abundance, quality deer hunting, things like that. And I will also say that, Wisconsin early on had sort of a aggressive approach to targeted removals, sharpshootings, things like that. But that hasn't been something that the state's been doing for 15 to 20 years. So it's been a long time since there's been any sort of heavy-handed management, earn a buck, anything like that. Okay, and last year in Iowa County, Wisconsin, they saw the lowest harvest that they ever have since 1979, which is a completely different trajectory than, let's say, southeastern Wisconsin that's far less impacted by chronic wasting disease. And the biologists there are really not able to link it to any other sort of ultimate cause that could be leading to what appears to be a sustained population decline and what appears to be, what very much is a sustained harvest decline. Every year we're losing harvest. I've got, certain contacts in the southwestern counties that anecdotally say things are starting to look a lot different. And it's not because the state's going in there and shooting deer. In fact, they stopped that long ago. What seems to be the scientific consensus in that part of the state is that chronic wasting disease may be starting to have more of a population level decline, and certainly such that it's impacting the age structure, leading to a younger population of deer. And of course, that's something that no hunters want.
So then what is I guess my biggest concern would be it sounds like there's a lot that we still don't know about this.
Absolutely.
Especially, like, to me, that the rate of transmission, that seems like a very concerning thing to not know and then have a solution for. So like what, and like I've said before too, I think Iowa, from everything I've read, is much different. My experience in Missouri was a little mind-blowing to me, just because I saw these humongous bait piles and, states go, and then all the locals tell me that the state's going in there and using a spotlight and smoking every deer off that pile at night. It was to me is like, okay, it seems like there could be some ulterior motives here. And so I guess my question on this is, what do we believe the solution is? Do we know what the solution is? And if we don't know what the solution is, are we better to act or to try to get a better understanding of what this is before we create a solution?
Yeah, so I think that the answer to that question, of course, is found to some degree in the plan that you're referencing. But since our listeners likely haven't read through that, which, by the way, the CWD response plan is on the deer hunting webpage of the Iowa DNR's website. For anybody that wants to see it, it's publicly available, and it gets into a lot more detail than, of course, we could hope to accomplish today. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot left to understand. These are really difficult questions to just come up with an answer to, especially things like disease transmission rates, efficacy of different management strategies, however intense those might be. I work very closely with my counterparts in other states, the deer program leaders in Missouri, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, who have gone a different route, at least at some point in their history, than what we've done in Iowa. And just to give them a little credit, the only motive that they have is to try to manage for a long-term healthy deer population. But obviously, as you mentioned, some of those strategies have led to a loss of hunter support, hunter trust. Those are things that we're very committed to maintaining in Iowa, which is why you might see a bit more of a mild approach here that we're taking in terms of our harvest-based management, the emphasis on maintaining quality, things like that. The reason being is because, there is no solution that's so self-evident that it makes sense to throw every caution to the wind, if that makes sense. So what we're trying to do from a harvest-based management standpoint is maintain balanced deer populations that avoid overabundance. That's something we've been trying to do before CWD came. Now, there's a lot of reasons to avoid overabundance, and deer quality is one of them. Of course, you guys would understand well that very high overabundant deer densities aren't exactly the best thing for antler development, for deer hunting quality, things like that. And so there's also a lot of reasons to avoid that from a non-hunter standpoint because, of course, deer impact all Iowans. What we're really focusing our resources on in Iowa is surveillance, education, and outreach and research. Because we're committed to trying to understand more about the disease. We're committed to trying to understand ways that we can be more resource efficient, ways that we can learn more to be in a better position as far as the disease goes. But of course, you'll never find the word sharpshooting, intense targeted removal, anything like that in that plan, because that's just not something that our department has ever done or really plans to do in the future.
I want to go back because I'm going to go with the caveman analogy that Warren used because but mine's common sense. Okay, so common sense from everything that I've heard you guys describe here from CWD would tell me that in 1967, some mule deer are brought in and we basically gave them the disease, we think. And then we turned them back into the wild there. Why wouldn't, over a period of time, because we've had plenty of years now, and I understand the disease takes a long time to actually take shape and to actually start to show up. We're looking at 58 years, roughly, that we would have. How come all of those deer, if it is that bad, if this thing is going to deteriorate an entire possible species, but it definitely a local group, how come we didn't see all those deer die of CWD by this time?
So first of all, we're talking about different species than whitetail deer, right? Of course, like mule deer, elk, each of those species brings sort of a different relationship with chronic wasting disease, which Rachel can certainly speak to better than I can, but things like transmission rates, incubation period, things like that are likely to be very different. But we are seeing population declines. The reason we're not seeing sort of an extirpation or local extinction is because even if a deer that hits the ground, the first day the fawn hits the ground, it gets CWD. That deer has 1.5 to 3 years before it's going to start seeing physical signs, which again, quickly deteriorate the health of that deer, inevitably lead to death. But in those 1.5 to 3 years, at least for whitetail deer in Iowa, they're almost certainly going to replace themselves through reproduction. If that's a doe, it has the chance, at least, to produce 3 to 6 more fawns during that time. That would then replace its death from CWD. So again, this isn't a disease that's going to wipe deer off the face of the earth. What it's going to do over time is create a younger population, basically squeeze that age class down, in such a way that seeing 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old animals is going to likely be much more rare and uncommon than it is today. And to me, as a deer hunter, as a deer manager, that's the biggest
Do we
fear.
really know that, though? Because if we don't know how much the transmission rate, how do we know that that's true? I mean, if this is only 10% that are getting that, then you're still going to get old deer.
Right, but in Wisconsin, for instance, they're seeing 50 to 60% prevalence rates with adult bucks, right? Meaning that we may not be seeing 100% prevalence, but okay, let's just assume 50% in Iowa County. That means that half of the bucks are going to likely die from CWD before they would reach an age that they would without the disease. Whether they contract that disease at day 1 or year 2 makes a big difference here. But assuming a 50% prevalence rate with does, that means that 50% of the fawns that are dropped, which of course are the bucks of the future, are going to come in contact with the disease. We know that vertical transmission is possible. I believe, Rachel, now the latest studies on that, meaning that fawns can contract CWD in utero. Even if that weren't to happen,
That's going to be my question of what vertical is.
Yeah,
the only reason I'd call it vertical is because it drops out of the deer.
Well, yeah, I think that dropping out of the deer, even if it's not CWD positive, nursing on a positive maternal doe is likely to lead to transmission as well. What I'm getting at is that what we do know about the disease, which is that it's 100% fatal, its incubation period, those two facts alone, should be concerning to people interested in sort of a strong upper age class of bucks on the landscape.
Okay, so I've got a theory more so of a question that you may have just answered, the fact that it's 100% fatal. But question is, if we know that there's areas that have had this disease for 50, 60 years and it's not wiping out the population, when we're looking at immunities to these different diseases and things, wouldn't it be smarter, and again, I could be wrong here, but wouldn't it be smarter to let nature run its course here? And yes, it may be a longer standpoint, but if we let nature run its course to where, yeah, we might see declines in age brackets and in more mature bucks, but after 20, 30 years, do we have any way of knowing that these deer could potentially be gaining an immunity to this, to where it's no longer a threat to the natural population anyways, and they're allowing themselves to recover and grow through this?
So I'll turn that over.
It sounds like it's not going to kill them.
It's going
to kill them, but not the whole population.
Sure. I just have one idea there. The tricky thing with, you're talking about natural selection, evolutionary pressures on the deer population to result in resistance or immunity. The reason that's probably not possible, or at least as likely with chronic wasting disease, is because, remember, the deer are still replacing themselves. They're still spreading that genetics through reproduction for 2 to 3 years prior to dying from CWD. Now, EHD is different because it kills deer acutely. And when EHD comes through a population, it's going to kill deer within a matter of weeks, and then those deer are no longer reproducing. But deer that are, let's say, genetically susceptible to CWD, which is all deer that we know of, for the record, those deer would all still have time to replace themselves through reproduction. So those selective pressures are very unlikely to actually cause any shift in resistancy over time. Rachel can speak much more intelligently about this topic.
Well, that's exactly right. I agree. And further, the place where we would see genetic resistance and, the breeding potential to breed out susceptibility to chronic wasting disease would be the captive industry. And there have been many examples of, these deer that have these high coefficients of essentially like vitality or viability against chronic wasting disease. And they succumb, like they naturally, it enters their herd and they also contract it and they succumb to the disease. So it just seems like at this point, we really can't rely on the deer kind of figuring it out on their own. And it's not to say that we're figuring out for them. We are in the same boat. There's some conversations about vaccine technology, which would be a nightmare to deploy in a free-ranging population. If the technology even comes to bear ultimately. But that's kind of where maybe there's a little bit of like light at the end of the tunnel, that there's other therapeutics that might come online. And I've just wanted to touch on the the transmission rate, and how that that is something that we could figure out, but there's a lot of different confounds, there's a lot of different components that can change that. But one thing that we know is congregating deer, so either high densities or congregating them around tight area, like around a mineral lick or something like that, some other attractant, that can certainly, elevate your transmission rate. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like if you're in an endemic area or in a county that has known positives, anything you can do to reduce the frequency of contact or the likelihood that they're all going to put their head in the same, pile of corn and apples, whatever, is going to reduce your risk of bringing chronic wasting disease onto your property. So that's one thing that's easy that we can control. Of course, there's other places where deer congregate naturally. We know their behaviors in the winter, like they're grouping up together. Like we can't control that, but the parts that are human mediated, that's something that we can have a real impact in, especially in our endemic areas.
So in the state of Iowa, if we were going to make this in the most simple form possible, and we were going to say, what is it that Iowa is trying to do to combat CWD? Is that we're just doing more research, or is it we need to kill more deer? Is it vaccines? What is that? And if you could give it to me in caveman terms, that would really be appreciated.
Yeah, so I'll speak to the harvest management because that's kind of the world that I live in. So the option is certainly not that we want to kill. We want to exterminate deer from a county because it has CWD. Our history just doesn't reflect that. Our management strategies don't reflect that. What we do in terms of harvest-based management in the name of chronic wasting disease is, first of all, entirely voluntary. Okay, so we're not, as an agency, coming in and sharpshooting deer, like you might have heard some other states doing. We're not hiring it out through private sharpshooting contractors. We're relying on a voluntary harvest management system that we always have. Now, what that looks like in Iowa depends on the population in that county, right? So we manage deer at a county scale in Iowa, as that plan sort of alluded to, in order to really have a better grasp on those local deer populations, because as you guys know, living here, our state is not one deer population. We have incredibly diverse landscapes from northwestern Iowa down to southeastern Iowa. The state might as well be two states, right? You could look at any corner of the state and observe different landscapes resulting in different habitat availability, resulting in different deer populations. And so that's first and foremost what goes into our management decisions. The only CWD-based harvest strategies that we've really employed in the last 13 years have been in areas in the state with high deer densities and our most abundant deer counties: Allamakee, Clayton, Dubuque, Wayne, Appanoose. And what we're doing in these counties, again, is not some intense targeted removal. It might be needling up county antlerless quotas slightly. It might be offering a deer management zone smaller than the county scale, focused on where those positives are for additional harvest opportunity. Those zones, by the way, have not been very popular, but they remain. They're about 100 tags going into this next season apiece. And in some cases, we'll have incentive hunts that operate on a much smaller sort of multi-property level, again, on a voluntary basis where property managers, landowners want to participate in. And the reason for doing that is just to maintain a balanced density, right? Because these are places in the state where there's a lot of habitat, where there's a lot of, landowner priorities that revolve around higher deer densities for recreation. And that means that sometimes we see deer densities that might exacerbate this disease. But we're by no means trying to drive numbers down. We're just trying to maintain opportunity for folks to manage deer through antlerless harvest as they see fit, right? So we're about empowering hunters and landowners to make responsible decisions, but we're not going anywhere and saying that there will not be any deer here in 12 months. Now, we've also detected chronic wasting disease in parts of western Iowa, where deer numbers are very low, and we're actually making a concerted effort to try to recover those populations through regulations and regulatory changes. Now, you couldn't point to any of those counties that we've done any sort of CWD harvest-based management, just because those populations are already so low that we're not as concerned about transmission being exacerbated through high densities, if that makes sense. We also know that CWD-based harvest in those counties would be very unpopular with hunters and recreationalists in that part of the state, and so all of those things get factored in. But I just hope it's obvious that we have a nuanced approach to CWD-based management. We don't have a one-size-fits-all solution for the state, and I almost don't like talking about the deer population in terms of a statewide scale, because we simply don't manage deer on a statewide scale.
Speak to
So
some
if we just look at this like
other aspects of research, sorry, just to jump in quick. So another part that I'm really the side that I'm steeped in is the diagnostic side, and kind of like the part that's a little more technical and that maybe people don't always care about, but what happens to our samples when we get them, and trying to advocate for hunters just making informed consumption decisions. So a lot of what we do other parts of the year outside of the hunting season is just trying to tell people, like, what is this disease? Like, answering these kinds of questions. We have really frank conversations. In the program I mentioned, CWD Ambassadors will be coming to Cedar Rapids in, I think, September. So if anyone's listening and wants to hear more, that would be an opportunity. And I oversee all of the testing that comes through our Iowa State Vet Diagnostic Lab for chronic wasting disease. And so some of those aspects of research are, how can we scale up when we know right now we test about 5% of all harvested deer in Iowa, or harvested or otherwise, roadkill, things like that. We're hitting about 5%. And if people, hopefully, buy in that this is a serious issue, that there is a potential public health consideration there, that part we still need to tease out. And unfortunately, there's a lot of uncertainty, but testing can be for, us, for our management purposes, but it could also be for you to make those informed consumption decisions. And so scaling up is a real issue. It's not very flashy, but we need to be able to build capacity. And so that's kind of the work that I've been doing at the lab.
What does it take to get a sample, and how long does it take for that sample to get a result back? Yeah,
so the sample itself is just a lymph node behind the jaw, basically. It's called the medial retropharyngeal lymph node. We will be bringing back to our website a card it's a sampling card that tells you basically what you can do to collect your own sample. We have a video through ISU Extension Outreach available too. And then, of course, we collect samples throughout the year. But the turnaround time, it really depends on how you submit. So if you submit through our surveillance program, that is a scenario where it could take a couple of weeks. We try to turn things around in 2 to 3 weeks once the sample has arrived at the lab. So that's always a sticking point, especially in, prime hunting seasons. We start getting into the holidays, things get a little backlogged. But we do have a hunter submission pathway. So that's where someone can pay to have their sample tested. So it's $25. It's what the DNR pays as well. And that the past several years, the turnaround time is about 1 day. So it's really quick. Once it hits the lab, it gets tested, expedited testing.
The reason I was asking that, one, for everybody else if they're wanting to test their own, but two, because I don't know how lucrative it would be, as far as there'd probably be some tax dollars that would have to go into it. But if we're trying to really figure out how many there genuinely are out there, if there was a way, and it doesn't sound like there might not be right now, but if there was a way to test them while they're alive, and if you could be testing these deer while they're alive, wild deer, and getting a return of whatever, if you could get that test back immediately, that'd be wonderful. But maybe a couple hours where you could literally see when you guys go in and you're I don't know, tranquilizing a group of deer in an area and you find one or two, it would be pretty simple to remove the one or two right there, and remove them from the population versus all these other states that are just massacre, hoping that they find some. But is the only way to get the sample is if it's a dead deer?
That's an interesting proposition. So we've benefited from a lot of studies out of Wisconsin, of course, because of their history with the disease. One of those included live sampling, but those deer went back out into the landscape. And so what we learned from that is that their survival probability per year basically is 50% that of a negative or test negative deer. But yeah, having it that rapid that they could still be, sedated and then we could just euthanize them right there. That's a world we don't live in yet, but we definitely get lots of questions.
Or guess you could tag them or something, though, so I can identify each one and then know. I don't know.
Well,
I'm just thinking of a way to mitigate just casualties if you have to get rid of a lot.
My question to that would be, if they don't show signs of it within a year and a half to 3 years, could you get a clear test from a deer and yet it still had it, or would it show that they have CWD but they're not showing signs yet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's definitely kind of a gray zone of when they can be recently infected and test negative, but still, be harboring the disease just at a low enough level that we can't detect it yet. One of the projects, kind of the scalable solutions I mentioned, looks at using this ultra-sensitive assay. And so that's where probably a future, 5 years down the line, we will be switching modalities to using this ultra-sensitive assay. So we have better, resolution on who's positive. Of course, with that comes the question of biological significance. So if your deer is that, recently exposed or recently infected, is it still a concern to consume that animal, or, would the recommendations change? And so we're not there yet, so we don't have to cross those bridges. But yeah, there's definitely that uncertainty still. And really with any test, any disease diagnostic that you use, you could be just too early to test positive.
But David, I think it's fair to say, and Rachel can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, there's a long period of time during that incubation period at which a deer will still test positive, though look perfectly healthy and normal. So that is actually the majority of positive samples that we get in Iowa have, they're hunter harvested deer that have yet to enter that sort of terminal phase after the incubation period runs its course.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Rachel.
I just to contextualize that. So within 3 months of being infected, so as early as 3 months, they become infectious to others. So and then they should be detectable, through our diagnostics as well. And so, they have maybe 3 years of shedding without any, or almost 3 years of shedding without any clinical signs. So 3 months, they start transmitting it through their saliva.
So if there's a landowner out there, or
how long before in their saliva?
So 3 months saliva, about 6 months for urine and feces, kind of front to back is how I always kind of visualize it.
So when they get it, then it's 3 months before saliva, 6 months.
Once they're infected, where they're showing infection, meaning they have the infection, they could give it within through saliva within 3 months, and then it progresses further to the other parts.
So don't be setting up kissing booths near your trail cameras.
Right. So here's my question though: a landowner, a hunter, someone finds a deer or sees a deer that's suffering from something. They don't know what it is. I had an incident last year that was similar to that. What do they do? But what should they do? What's the right thing? Number one, I know they can't just go kill it and say, okay, well, and drag it in the ditch and say, well, it might have had CWD and I don't want it to get to anyone else. What should a landowner do, or what should that person do?
So if a landowner were to observe a sick-looking deer, that's something our department is interested in knowing. And in fact, we've gotten a lot of these calls. I say a lot, but more every year. And we can have conservation officers or field staff go out and dispatch that deer to test it, just to, of course, provide our department some information on surveillance, but also to give that landowner, confirmatory peace of mind, or, understand the issue that's on his property through that testing. Let's say that it's a positive deer. At that point, if I was a landowner found a positive deer on my property, I would definitely weigh that into my deer management decisions in terms of trying to maintain, the lowest prevalence possible, or at least acceptable through, reasonable doe harvest, which you guys, I'm sure, are well versed on quality deer management. One of the main tenets of quality deer management is responsible doe harvest. That's something that we've known in deer management for decades, and it's something that I think a lot of our hunters understand, especially some of the younger generations coming into the sport that have always seen good deer numbers. So that should be a perennial objective of any landowner that's conscious of deer management. Now that doesn't mean shoot every doe you see necessarily, but it just basically trying to incorporate some element of doe harvest into your annual harvest strategy. Doing property level surveys, camera surveys, drone surveys, things like that can really be informative. And again, our department's message is just empowering landowners and hunters with information, with recommendations if they ask. But ultimately, these are private individuals with private properties and their own priorities. We hope that those priorities consider the long-term health of the deer population. But ultimately, our job here is to inform and help in that regard. But property level deer management decisions are the prerogative of every landowner.
One of my next questions here. I'm not saying that this is Iowa because I don't think this is you guys, but is this somewhat a COVID situation? And what I mean by that is it sounds as though we're somewhat saying, okay, let's reduce populations in areas where there's too many deer, and it's going to lower the speed of this spread of CWD. In COVID, we all locked down to try and decrease the spread of COVID, and that clearly didn't work. Is this something that you may not be able to really put a cap on, because even in your lower areas like western Iowa, you get into the rut and you get a horny buck who travels and has CWD and covers 25-mile radius in a few weeks and infects every deer in the area. I mean, is it really possible to actually even be slowing it down?
I think that, the answer that our department would give, which might differ from others, is that, we believe it's likely to reduce transmission through responsible, appropriate harvest. Does anybody truly understand everything there is to know about those dynamics? Of course not. It's an incredibly difficult, complex topic. It's unfortunate that the COVID pandemic sort of, I believe it had ripple impacts on just overall general public trust in government health, and I think that CWD has always been sort of a controversial issue due to how it's been handled, for better or worse. But I think that certainly didn't help. And I think that it's fair to draw parallels there. But what we're doing in Iowa, I think, is pretty defensible. We're not really in a position to speak for other states in terms of their priorities and objectives, management strategies, and things like that. But, to answer your question, is it possible that this disease is something that we'll never get a handle on or be able to completely eliminate? Certainly. There's a lot of unknowns. And, it would be disingenuous for me to sit here and tell you that we're going to fix the CWD disease in Iowa. Frankly speaking, what we're trying to do is maintain the quality that we have on this landscape as long as we can, including in the short term.
Yeah.
I'm
Which too, I want you guys to know, if there is one state agency in this country that I trust, it is the Iowa DNR. So just so you guys know I'm asking you tough caveman questions, but I think that's because you guys can answer it. And I honestly do believe that that the Iowa DNR does have the best interest of hunters and everybody at heart. And there's a lot of other state agencies that I don't know that I don't believe that. And I think so. I know you guys can't comment on that, right? That's just. And I would recommend you probably don't. But I can, because I'm just a citizen, right? So I think that of all people, you guys I trust, so that would bring me to the last thing here. Because or my last question, because I do trust you guys. In here, it says multiple times, the Iowa Deer Program manages the whitetail deer population through an engaged stakeholder process, which is reflected by the annual meeting of the Deer Study Advisory Committee. This committee includes a balanced number of stakeholder groups representing agricultural, recreational, and economical special interests. A series of DNR listening sessions is also held each spring to capture perspectives from members of other key stakeholder groups, such as hunters and landowners, which are summarized and provided to the Natural Resources Commission. So where I'm going with that is, like I said, if there is one state agency in this country that I trust, it is you guys. It's the Iowa DNR. However, that sentence also makes me very nervous, especially if I'm looking at other states, as far as a stakeholder process. Because to me, what I think of as a stakeholder process, especially if I'm in agricultural, and I think we all know farmers like this, where if my special interest is to get rid of as many deer as possible because I get more corn per bushel and everything else, and I make more money. So to some extent, to me, that's where I'm almost like, and at the same time, even hunters. There, in Western Iowa, for instance, there may be times where guys are like, no, I still want a buck tag. And really, the situation is you guys need to remove buck tags. And I think that we should be able to trust our state agency, and we need to, and that probably should be your guys' sole discretion, because you have more information, you have more knowledge, and you guys understand what is going to happen and what should be happening. And like I said, now this is completely different if you don't trust your state agency. Like I said, in Iowa, we're very fortunate. But I could see in other states, in Missouri and stuff like that, it would be very easy to say, and a huge insurance group, one of the agricultural ones, where, you know, if they can work with a state agency and reduce the deer population by 15%, then their car wrecks go down by X percent. That saves them $1 billion a year.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, and it's of course something that I'm involved in heavily. I lead that Deer Study Advisory Committee meeting every year, and I think it's really important to include those groups. Like, there's some insurance people there sometimes, but I'd say it's more on the side of agricultural special interest groups, and then hunter conservationist special interest groups. And of course, the priorities are completely at odds with whitetail deer, and that's, no surprise. But I think that it's important to set it up like that because, our job with the DNR and my job with the deer program is not to manage a population for Iowa's deer hunters. It's to manage a healthy, balanced population for Iowans. Now, one of my top priorities is a quality deer population as much as possible wherever the landscape allows. But that also means that, you're right, there are hunters that would like to see a deer behind every tree. And of course, we have to consider other things as well. But I don't want you to read that sentence and think, for a minute that there's any particular group that sits at that table that has any more of a sway on how we manage deer in Iowa than any other. Now, I can't speak for any sort of deer management decisions outside of the DNR, right? Like legislative or otherwise, but in our department, in our deer program, I personally think it's incredibly important to consider all of those stakeholders because they're all Iowans too, and we're here to manage the population for Iowans. In terms of that, those formal engagements, the Deer Study Advisory Committee, that's a once annual meeting. We typically have, a couple dozen folks representing a group each at that meeting. And then the public listening sessions are sort of our other formal engagement. We have 16 of those across the state every spring, and typically in the February, March timeframe. But in terms of the deer program, there's a lot more engagement that goes beyond those sort of formal annual processes. You mentioned Western Iowa. In over the last 12 months, I've held 11 public meetings in Western Iowa specifically to talk about how to recover deer populations through regulatory changes. So we're really focusing on keeping hunters along with us as we explore new regulations that are going to, hopefully allow for a population recovery, a increased quality of deer hunting experience in that part of the state. And right now, Western Iowa is a big priority of mine because the resource has truly been degraded significantly in many counties. And that's not to say that any other part of the state isn't also deserving of that attention and effort too. We just happen to have it pretty good in central, southern, and eastern Iowa. Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, most of us, I don't think, complain too much.
Right.
Yeah, I just, I think it can be very easy where there can be a perception of, well, how much influence does that have over your guys' decisions? Because if the data says, you know what, we need to cut tags, and I'm sure I know emotionally, me as a hunter, if I lived in Western Iowa and you guys said, hey, we got to cut the buck tags, emotionally, I am not going to like that. And I don't blame any of them either. However, I could understand scientifically and realistically that may be what has to happen in order for it to preserve that resource for years to come. And that's where I'm just curious, and you answered it on how much influence are those groups having over those decisions, which I think it sounds like you're more taking their input and trying to understand where they're at, more so than letting them make decisions.
Let me answer it more directly. Those Deer Study Advisory Committee meetings occur typically after the deer hunting seasons, after I've held my district deer meetings where I travel across the state, talking to different local field staff, conservation officers, things like that about regional county level regulation changes. When we have that advisory committee meeting with all those stakeholders, I'm presenting our proposed regulatory changes for the next year. So that meeting is occurring after we've sort of shaped out a draft of our regulatory changes. There's always great discussion. It's very important to hear from those folks in terms of their perceptions of those changes. But I can say honestly that in my time, in my role, those proposed changes have never altered after that meeting in favor of one group or another, right? So we're dedicated to a data-driven management approach with plenty of engagement of all stakeholders. But hopefully that answers and speaks to your concerns a little more directly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for you guys to do that, because if you decide, hey, we only care about deer hunters now, we don't care about the farmers, and we're only going to give the deer hunters what they want, well, at some point you're probably going to hit something that breaks, and the farmer's going to say, well, you know what? We're not going to let anybody hunt anything. We're not going to lease anything. We're not going to do anything. And you guys and we're going to just shoot deer. And now you guys have to arrest all of us or some huge issue like that. And so I do I understand the balance and completely see where you guys are coming from. Like I said, I'll say it again. I think that we are very fortunate that I do feel as though I trust you guys. Like there's no other state where, I don't know all the other ones well enough, but I know several others where I'd be much more nervous about their integrity.
Fair enough. He's trying to be politically correct. So is there anything, because I feel like you guys have answered as many questions as possible. I'm sure that we're going to create a lot more from when we put this podcast out. But at this time, though, is there something, Rachel or Jace, that we didn't cover that you guys want to make sure that we hit, or feel like we covered everything? I feel like they've answered the majority of my questions.
For the past several years, we've had an interactive dashboard now on our website. And so I would just steer folks there. You can see exactly where, basically, in real time, but right now it's, samples are just kind of trickling through. As we get into the hunting seasons, we will start getting, lots more samples, and you can track in real time where we're getting detections. You can look, even now when there's not much to look at for this year, you could look at historic data and see if you're hunting in a county that has positives, or you're planning to hunt in a county, prepare for your hunt ahead of time, that kind of thing. And if you have questions, reach out to us. We're extremely accessible and I think happy to chat further.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks, Rachel. That dashboard is something I was going to mention too. We've got a lot of resources. We mentioned EHD a little bit at the beginning of this, but I do want your listeners to know as well that we're interested in collecting data about hemorrhagic disease, specifically any mortalities they might find. In case you guys aren't aware, we just recently developed a EHD blue tongue reporting tool that's now actually on the Iowa DNR app under the toolbox, just to make it very convenient for folks to use in the field. They can also find it on our deer hunting and deer health website. just wanted to take advantage of the platform here, just so folks know we're entering potential EHD season. I'm hoping all the precipitation we've gotten has us out of the weeds.
What links do we, because we talked about one way before too, that for people to go check out. Was it this? Oh, is this study, I think.
Yeah.
So we're going to need to get that link for everybody that's listening, which we can get. I'm kind of recapping here.
Well, anything you guys want to plug, go ahead. Get it in there. So we got the app.
To the hemorrhagic disease piece, we use the same tissue to screen for hemorrhagic disease as CWD. So if your listeners, find dead deer and they want to, screen and actually know what happened to that deer, we can do that. So as long as they're not too degraded. So the summer months are a little bit tricky, but
okay. And I just pulled mine up because I had been there and seen this tool. But basically, when you go to and now it comes up as Go Outdoor Iowa, and you just click on your app if you have it on your phone or your computer, and then go to the toolbox. And when you click on the toolbox, you have sunrise, sunset, feeding times, but the last one is EHD, blue tongue reporting. And click on that, and then you can go through there and do what Jace is talking about. So that, and if I'm not in there right now, but at one point, does it show you how many reported cases per county?
That's another tool that we have. It's not found on the app. You'd have to go to our deer hunting website for that, but that would be an EHD blue tongue dashboard. And it gives you real-time information of whatever gets submitted through that tool. And I obviously, it's a very important data set for our department to understand local impacts and sort of how our deer management is going to adapt as we get more information. Of course, the 24 season, I don't have to tell you guys, perhaps in Madison County, I don't know if you had property level impacts, but many folks did in that part of the state. And so that's great information for us to know, and it does make a difference in how we proceed with regulations.
I just want to go back and kind of reiterate what Warren said and tell you guys, having lived in 4 states, this DNR, this wildlife agency is one of the top. I mean, in my opinion, you guys, I think you're doing what our president is doing now. You're doing your job with common sense, because it seems like this is all factual and we have all this about data and this, but at some point in time, common sense has to rule. And that's what I've loved about Iowa is it's a common sense approach that, hey, we do believe that people like to see a lot of deer, but at the same time, we can't have too many. And if we want to have quality, then we want to have the right kind of balance and things like that. You guys seem to listen to the public extremely well and take those interpretations and then move on them. And so hats off. We sure appreciate having you guys on here. I know we're going to talk about doing some other stuff. Jace, I think we may have you back, or Andy, or I don't know, Rachel, you might be involved too we wanted to do another one at some point where we're just specifically talking about wildlife deer management. And because we have tons of, if we think we got a lot of CWD questions, we get more questions about what do I do for my deer? How do I make my bucks bigger? Or if you're one of those guys watching out there and you have a big buck you want shot, you just call us and then we'll come in and take care of it for you.
So generous.
Yeah. But no, I just want to thank you guys again for taking the time, coming on with us and answering these questions.
Before we let them go.
Yep.
We do a segment called The Wacky Fact. And it is just some wild, unhinged fact. And I feel as though you guys may have one or two. So, not to put you two on the spot, and I'll go first and give you guys a minute or so, but see if you can come up with one. I think that could be pretty good. And then you have to deal with a little button man to see if you get a green button or a red button.
That's me. I'm the little button man.
Well, not to steal your thunder, Rachel, but if you just see if people could spell the human version of CWD that you talked about, I think that would work.
Right?
Yeah. All right, Warren. Get it going.
The Andean condor, one of the world's largest soaring birds, has a wingspan of nearly 10 feet 10 inches. It can fly more than 100 miles without flapping its gliding on thermals for over 5 hours, flapping just 1% of its flight time.
I'll give you a green. But I did watch a whole documentary on that specific bird.
That's
and they're
crazy,
freaking
though.
Nuts. Yeah, they are. I've got an eagle story I forgot to tell, but
that's a lazy-ass bird. Just freaking, and then we're done.
You have one, or do you need me to buy you a little more time?
Well, I can give you one that I'm not sure is going to win me a green light, and if it doesn't, then I can give you a physical attribute of the deer's athletic ability. But the first one I'll mention is relates to juvenile dispersal of whitetail deer, and I think it's well understood in the hunting community that male, juvenile males, yearling bucks, in other words, will disperse long distances. Sometimes that's half a mile. In the fragmented landscapes of Iowa, that could be as much as 25 to 50 miles, seeking new territory. Now, the primary theory on why that's done is actually to avoid inbreeding with its maternal doe. And so by distancing itself from that maternal doe, the likelihood of mixing the same genetics goes down quite a bit. Interesting enough, female juveniles, yearling does actually disperse as well in some populations as much as 25 to 50%, reaching sometimes the same dispersal distances as their male counterparts.
You say 25 to
Nice.
50 miles?
Miles is what he said on the buck,
Yeah.
on the juvenile
That would
bucks.
be
Jeez.
Here's the problem, though, is what you just said there is if the two dummies go to the same place, they end up freaking kissing cousins in another county. So
yeah. You'd hope they pick different.
and what do you
I'm,
consider-
I'm giving a green light on that
Yeah.
because that is very intriguing.
that they
What's
take that
defined as a juvenile buck?
Yeah, so
Year and a
that
half.
typically
Year and a half,
happens.
okay.
So anyway, a juvenile buck, for most people's standards, would be a yearling, like not a fawn, but the first set of antlers a buck would
First
throw.
antlers.
Dispersal tends to happen around the same time, or perhaps a bit before fawns give birth. So at this point, they become very adversarial to their offspring and kind of kick them out of the area. That usually spurs them to go a considerable distance. What's interesting is that there's been studies that show if the maternal doe gets harvested while that fawn is a fawn, the likelihood of it remaining on that property goes up tenfold. So,
Nice.
so if you want to
like the
maintain
bucks
your
that
button
we
bucks
have,
on your property, just shoot the maternal doe. That's not actual
Yeah.
management advice, but it's true.
That throws such a wild wrench in things too when you think about like the deer that you're like, well, this has to be this deer's genetics. I guess unless you shot the doe, like if you're like, oh, I had this buck a few years ago, this deer's definitely related to him. Would it be fair to say probably the odds of that is probably no?
Not necessarily, because there's always a proportion of fawns that will remain. So for bucks, that might be 20% of yearling bucks are going to remain in the same home range. And also dispersal could be a quarter mile or a half mile. And we know that bucks can travel that distance during the rut. So they could disperse a half mile. 3 years later, you might see them on your property in November.
So this explains where all the damn spikes. They're not from around my place. They're coming from freaking Nebraska,
Yeah.
and they're ending up at my place.
Wait, so though with their first rack, then would that when you're seeing them with their first rack, would that be a deer that's staying there, or would he then leave after the season?
Dispersal would occur before the first set of hard antlers.
Okay, so when he's there, then you could, if there's some odd instance where you recognize him at one, he could be there till mature.
Yeah, or at least he's maintained whatever home range he's found himself in come hunting season of his first set of hard antlers. He's either post dispersal or likely won't disperse.
Okay.
So the next forked horn I see, I'm going to tell him, welcome. Glad you're in the neighborhood, you know. Rachel, do you have one you wanted to throw out here? Or
It'll just be short, but maybe practical. So related to sampling for chronic wasting disease. So a lot of times I'll get texts, emails, things about what's wrong with my deer. There's all these maggots inside it. And it's right by the medial retropharyngeal lymph node. So back here behind the jaw. There's something called the retropharyngeal pouches. And that's where these things called nasal bots, so laid by bot flies, they lay eggs in the nostrils. The bot larvae, hatch and then migrate into the nasal turbinate. So if you were to bisect a deer's head, you can see bots like throughout the nasal passages. Not all of them, but it's very, very common. And they also congregate in these things called the retropharyngeal pouches, which are right next to where that lymph node is. So a lot of people will breach that pouch when they're going to collect their sample, and they'll be like, "What's wrong with my deer? This is gross." And it's a little gross, but it's just the normal ecology of that botfly's life cycle. So.
And what's the
And that's
biggest?
healthy for the deer.
Pretty gross.
Yeah, it really doesn't cause issues. I mean, when they are ready to mature into adults, they will end up getting like sneezed out or coughed out onto the ground, and then they'll become adults and fly away.
Okay. I'm gonna give you a green, but I don't want to because that is disgusting.
That's a lot of what I
But
got.
that is wild. I've
Huge
never heard
maggot.
that. That is nuts.
Yeah.
I'll give a green button. Can you spell retropharyngeal?
Retropharyngeal?
Do you? Yeah, or what is it? Retro?
Yeah, retropharyngeal. So
RETRO.
Hold on,
Yeah,
hold
you
on.
got
I
the
want to
first
see if
part.
she knows how to spell it.
RETRO.
Wait, so can you pronounce it?
Retropharyngeal.
Can you just pronounce it? Pharyngeal.
Pharyngeal.
We should see if any of us can
So
spell
like the
it.
pharynx, which is like the
If you
throat,
know the
basically.
proper spelling.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you think you can spell it?
Yeah.
No, but I'll try. I'll throw it out.
All right, you try.
Can you say it one more? Can you use it in a? No, I'm. Say it one more time so I can at least try to get this correct.
Retropharyngeal.
Okay, so the very first part is whether it's going to start with an F or PH.
You got to do the retro first. I got to make sure you can even spell that.
RETRO dash, I'm guessing, is in there. PHORENGIAL.
That's pretty
Did
close.
you get it?
Phonetically, it works.
Okay.
It's got the letters in the alphabet.
You gonna take a stab at it? I'm gonna
Me?
ask one question.
Who?
Was he right on starting with an F, or was he supposed to start
It's
with a
PH.
PH?
Yep, you were right. You were right
Yeah,
on
it's got to
there.
be.
Okay, so PHORINGEAL.
So you both got stumped. It's an A, not an O.
Non-A.
A
Oh,
R
no, I should have guessed.
Y, not I. Yeah.
I figured I was gonna get that because I was the runner-up in the 5th grade spelling bee.
All right.
All right, well, guys, and gals, we sure appreciate you guys for taking this time and hopefully educating a bunch of people. And we'll send you guys the link and everything. Do me a favor, don't hang up when we get done. Make sure that we get everything recorded. So, but other than that, as far as everyone out there in podcast land, go to the Raised Hunting website, man. It is heating up, and when I don't mean just in the summertime, it is July, and we are all thinking deer right now. So Raised Scents are out there, Raised Knox, the Canine line, all kinds of apparel. You name it. We've also got some accessories and things like that you're going to check out because you guys are going to start building scrapes. And so I just wanted to bring that stuff up on behalf of the DNR and the entire Holder family. Raised Hunting says thank you, and we'll see you next week.